The Chicago wind howled through the steel canyons of the Magnificent Mile, but in the heart of the Han estate, the air was as still as a tomb. The mansion, a monolith of glass and cold granite, loomed over the city like a fortress, its hypermodern walls shielding secrets that even the most ruthless power brokers dared not whisper. Surveillance lenses tracked every movement from the shadows, and silent, stony-faced security teams patrolled the perimeter with the lethal precision of a private army. This was no mere residence. It was the seat of an empire forged in iron will, ambition, and a legacy of absolute control. Beyond the reinforced gates, the public knew Han Seo-jun as a titan of industry, a man whose face was a fixture in financial journals and whose philanthropic donations moved mountains in the political landscape. But within these sterile high-tech halls, the truth was far colder. Han Seo-jun was the undisputed master of his world, a man who viewed emotion as a weakness and loyalty as a commodity. Today, however, the silence was broken by an accusation that would ignite a war within his own blood. Standing in the center of the grand foyer was Ye-jin Bridge, his fiancée, a woman who wore her designer elegance like a suit of armor and her sharp high-society pedigree as a weapon. Beside her, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the suffocating weight of an impending judgment. She stood with her chin lifted high, a wolf scenting blood in the water. Facing her stood Lidia Vane, the quiet force that kept the house breathing. Dressed in her simple, modest uniform, her hands, often covered in the residue of the work no one else would do, trembled slightly against her apron. For years she had been the invisible guardian of the family's most fragile hearts, never imagining that her devotion would one day be twisted into a crime. The massive oak doors groaned as Seo-jun entered, his presence carrying the heavy, unforgiving weight of a man who had forgotten how to bleed. His suit was tailored to perfection, and his face was a mask of unreadable stone, his eyes scanning the scene without a trace of warmth or mercy. But it was not the titan who drew the eye. It was the small, somber figure standing in the shadows of his wake. Soo-min, his 7-year-old daughter, stood with a depth in her eyes that did not belong to a child. She did not move, she did not cry out, she simply watched with the terrifying clarity of one who sees through every mask, every lie, and every hidden intention. In her hand she clutched a smartphone like a holy relic, a digital bomb waiting to detonate the carefully crafted lies of a queen. The Chicago winter did not just blow, it searched. It clawed at the reinforced thermal glass of the Han estate, seeking a single crack in the armor of the man who ruled the city's concrete heart. Inside, the silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket maintained by high-tech filters and the unblinking eyes of 1,000 cameras. Han Seo-jun stood at the apex of his tower, a silhouette against the flickering neon of the Chicago skyline. To the world, he was a king of industry, a man whose signature could move markets and whose silence could break rivals. But here, in the sterile perfection of his fortress, he was a man defined by what he had lost and the iron walls he had built to ensure he never lost again. The routine of the mansion was a clockwork of power and invisibility. Every morning at precisely 6 a.m., the soft hum of the climate control shifted, and the silent, stony-faced security teams completed their perimeter sweep, moving with the lethal grace of shadows. Seo-jun's life was an endless loop of cold, calculated movements, briefings on global trade, calls that decided the fates of thousands, and the constant low-frequency buzz of surveillance. He moved through the halls like a shadow in his own life, a man who had traded the warmth of human connection for the cold certainty of control. Yet there was one pulse of reality in this tomb of glass and stone. In the sun-bleached corner of the morning room, his 7-year-old daughter, Soo-min, sat in a pool of light that never quite reached her father. She was a somber, watchful child, possessing eyes that seemed to weigh the very soul of the man who had provided her with everything but himself. Nearby, moving with a quiet, rhythmic grace that the machines could never mimic, was Lidia Vane. She was the invisible hum of the household, the one who polished the silver until it reflected the family's hollow perfection and who whispered stories to a child who lived in a fortress of silence. Lidia was the only one who dared to breathe life into the cold granite. She tended to Seo-jun's fragile elderly mother with a tenderness that felt like a rebellion against the mansion's clinical atmosphere. Seo-jun watched them through the monitors, a voyeur to the intimacy he no longer knew how to claim. He saw the way Lydia's hand lingered on his mother's shoulder, a gesture of pure, unbought loyalty. He saw it, but he did not feel it. In his world, loyalty was a contract and safety was a high-resolution feed. He believed his fortress was impenetrable, never realizing that the greatest threat to a man who controls everything is the one thing he cannot see: the poison of a lie spoken with an elegant smile. The clinical perfection of the Han mansion was breached not by a storm, but by a whisper of silk and the cold scent of white lilies. Ye-jin Bridge did not simply enter a room, she colonized it. As Seo-jun's fiancée, she moved through the Chicago fortress with the practiced air of a queen reclaiming a throne, her sharp high-fashion silhouette cutting through the soft morning light like a blade. She was the social mirror of Seo-jun's power, elegant, flawless, and possessed of a grace that felt as engineered as the estate's security encryption. Ye-jin's arrival shifted the mansion's internal pressure. She began to mark her territory with subtle, lethal precision, moving ornaments an inch to the left and redrawing the boundaries of the household's quiet routine. To Seo-jun she was the ideal partner, a woman of breeding who understood the weight of his name and the architecture of his world. But to those who lived in the shadows of the glass walls, she was a wolf draped in couture. Her dominance was most acutely felt by Lidia Vane. Whenever Lidia entered a room to tend to the elderly matriarch, Ye-jin's presence would turn glacial. She didn't use raised voices, she used the devastating power of the unseen. She would look through Lidia as if she were part of the furniture, her disdain manifesting in the way she would point to a stray speck of dust or hand over a tea tray with a deliberate, lingering silence that screamed of her perceived superiority. It was a psychological war of attrition, a quiet campaign to remind the Afro-American maid that in this house of gold, she was merely a shadow. Ye-jin's eyes, sharp as broken glass, constantly tracked the bond between Lidia and the rest of the family. She saw the way Sumin's somber face brightened when Lidia approached, and she saw the instinctive trust the grandmother placed in Lydia's gentle hands. To an insecure heart masked by arrogance, this was a threat. To Ye-jin, Lidia was not a servant. She was a rival for the soul of the house. A woman who possessed the one thing Ye-jin could never buy: genuine, unforced love. As the Chicago wind rattled the thermal panes, Ye-jin stood in the grand foyer, watching Lidia work. The fiancée's smile was as perfect as a porcelain mask, but behind it, a dark plan was already beginning to coil, born of a jealousy that could not tolerate being second to a maid. The morning peace of the Chicago mansion did not fade. It was executed. It happened in the grand foyer, under the cold, judgmental glow of the crystal chandeliers. Ye-jin Bridge stood at the center of the marble floor, her face a mask of righteous horror that felt as sharp and calculated as a razor's edge. She held Han Seo-jun's mother by the arm, the fragile matriarch trembling, her eyes clouded with a confusion that no one in the room dared to translate. With a practiced, dramatic flourish, Ye-jin pulled back the silk sleeve of the elderly woman's gown, revealing a constellation of dark, ugly bruises blooming against the translucent skin. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. Seo-jun stood motionless, his dark eyes fixed on the marks of violence. In that moment, the iron control he spent his life perfecting began to fracture. He didn't see a medical mystery. He saw a violation of his fortress, a stain on the one thing he was sworn to protect. Ye-jin's voice cut through the air like a whip, trembling with a staged but lethal intensity as she pointed a manicured finger directly at Lidia Vane. The accusation was a thunderclap: maltreatment, systematic abuse, a betrayal of the bread Lidia had eaten at their table. Lidia stood paralyzed near the servants' entrance, the weight of the mansion suddenly pressing down on her shoulders. The air in the room turned to ice. She looked at the bruises, then at the boss, her heart hammering against her ribs with the force of a trapped bird. She didn't shout, she didn't wail. Her defense was a whisper, a soft, broken plea that barely reached the vaulted ceiling. I would never hurt her. But in the House of Han, words were cheap and the visual evidence was a hanging judge. Ye-jin pressed the attack, her sharp elegance weaponized as she demanded immediate justice, her insecurity masked by a roar of moral outrage. She spoke of police, of reports, of cleansing the house of the poison that had crept in. Seo-jun looked at Lidia, searching for a lie in the Afro-American woman's steady, tear-filled gaze, but the logic of his world demanded a sacrifice. The evidence was undeniable, and the elderly woman, trapped in a silent world of her own, could offer no rescue. Without another word, the decree was issued. The kindness that had kept the mansion breathing was officially exiled, and as Lidia was led toward the Chicago cold, the shattered silence left behind a house that was no longer a home but a crime scene. The verdict did not come with the bang of a gavel, but with a silence that felt like the earth opening up. Seo-jun stood in the center of his Chicago fortress, his face a mask of unyielding granite, while the air around him vibrated with the raw energy of a life being dismantled. He looked at Ye-jin Bridge, her eyes shining with a calculated, tragic fire, and then at Lidia Vane, who stood small and broken against the vast, cold backdrop of the marble hall. For a man who had built an empire on logic and undeniable proof, the bruises on his mother's arm were a sentence that could not be appealed. The pressure in the room was suffocating, a psychological vice tightening with every second of Seo-jun's deliberation. He was a man caught between the woman he had chosen to lead his house and the woman who had quietly made it a home. But in the end, the optics of the elite won over the whispers of the heart. He could not fathom that the elegant Ye-jin would weave such a monstrous lie, and his analytical mind, blinded by the physical evidence, demanded a clean break to protect the sanctum of his family. Seo-jun's voice, when it finally broke the silence, was as cold and sharp as a Chicago winter. He did not look Lidia in the eye, he looked through her as if she had already become a dusk in his halls. The command was a sharp blade. She was to pack her things and be gone before the sun cleared the skyline. There would be no recommendation, no mercy, and no second chances. Lidia did not scream for justice or beg for her livelihood. She simply lowered her head, the soft weight of the betrayal crushing the breath from her lungs. "I would never hurt her," she whispered one last time, a fragile truth cast into a storm of granite. As she turned to leave, the heavy oak doors groaning as they closed behind her, the mansion felt not more secure but hollowed out. Ye-jin's hand settled on Seo-jun's shoulder, a touch that should have felt like comfort but instead felt like the slow, cold coil of a hunter claiming its prize. The judgment was final, the obvious truth had been served, and as the darkness of the mansion deepened, Seo-jun stood alone in his victory, unaware that he had just exiled the only light left in his house. The Chicago wind rattled the thermal panes of the Han estate, but inside the silence was more voracious than the storm. With Lidia Vane gone, the mansion didn't just feel empty. It felt hollowed out as if the very soul had been surgically removed from its granite chest. The clinical perfection that Seo-jun had spent a lifetime maintaining now felt like a tomb, cold and indifferent to the living shadow wandering its corridors. Soo-min had retreated into a silence that was deafening. The 7-year-old no longer sat in the patches of morning light. She existed in the corners, a small, somber shadow with eyes that accused her father every time he dared to look. She refused her meals, the gourmet offerings left untouched like sacrifices to a god that no longer answered. When Seo-jun tried to approach, she didn't wince or cry out. She simply looked through him with the terrifying clarity of a child who had seen a king commit an act of cowardice. The toys and luxury he had piled around her were revealed for what they truly were, cold plastic and expensive distractions that could not replace the warmth of the woman he had exiled. But it was in the grandmother's room where the betrayal screamed the loudest. Without Lydia's gentle hands to anchor her, the elderly matriarch drifted into a sea of visible distress. She paced the length of her room with a frantic, disjointed energy, her eyes searching the doorway for a face that never appeared. She refused to let Ye-jin Bridge touch her, pulling away from the fiancé's elegant, manicured hands as if they were coated in ice. The confusion that had once been a quiet fog had turned into a storm of agitation. She would mutter in broken syllables, her fingers plucking at the silk of her sleeves where the bruises were still fading, dark reminders of a lie that was currently poisoning the house. Seo-jun watched the disintegration of his family through the high-definition feeds of his security monitors, his jaw set in a mask of unyielding stone. He saw his mother's tears and his daughter's withdrawal, yet his analytical mind still clung to the obvious truth he had served. He believed he had protected his fortress, but as he stood alone in the grand foyer, the silence of the mansion whispered a different story. A story of a man who had built walls so high he could no longer see the hearts breaking inside them. The memory flickered in the darkness of Soo-min's mind, as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. It had happened in that liminal hour before the Chicago sunset, when the shadows grew long and cutting across the mansion's sterile hallways. Soo-min had been sitting in the recessed alcove of the upstairs corridor, a small, unnoticed dusk clutching her smartphone, the only window she had into a world that often ignored her. She had been filming a quiet video for her father, a digital letter to a man who was always present but never truly there. Then the silence of the hallway was broken. Her grandmother had emerged from her room, moving with the brittle, uncertain gait of a woman lost in the fog of her own fading mind. She was a fragile vessel drifting toward a reef. Seo-jun watched through the lens, her finger frozen on the record button as the matriarch's slipper caught on the edge of a heavy silk rug. Time seemed to decelerate. The elderly woman gasped, a soft, terrified sound as her balance betrayed her. She didn't just fall. She collapsed, her frail frame striking the hardwood with a sickening, hollow thud. The camera shook as Seo-jun's breath hitched, but she did not stop recording. From the opposite end of the hallway, Ye-jin Bridge appeared, her designer heels clicking with the rhythmic, cold efficiency of a metronome. She stopped 10 feet away. She didn't rush forward. She didn't cry out. She stood there, a statuesque wolf in ivory silk, her eyes sweeping over the fallen woman with a clinical, detached curiosity that was more chilling than any act of violence. She watched the grandmother struggle, her manicured hands remaining at her sides, her face a mask of calculated indifference. Then the air was cut by the sound of running footsteps, raw, frantic, and filled with a desperation that Ye-jin could never fathom. Lidia Vane burst into the frame. She went to her knees on the hard floor, her face a map of genuine agony as she gathered the grandmother into her arms. Lidia was weeping, her voice a broken litany of apologies and comfort as she checked for injuries, her hands moving with a tenderness that could only be born of a sacrificial love. Through the screen, Seo-jun saw the truth. The lowly maid was the only one who bled for the family. In the shadows of the alcove, the child held the glowing screen close to her chest, her heart hammering like a trapped bird. She had captured the soul of the house and the poison of the liar in a single unblinking eye of digital fire, and she knew that this flickering light was the only weapon strong enough to shatter her father's fortress of glass. The midnight hour in Chicago carried a bite that could settle in a man's marrow, but inside Han Seo-jun's private office, the cold was architectural. He sat behind a desk of obsidian and steel, a solitary figure illuminated only by the clinical blue glow of a dozen monitors. The fortress was quiet, yet the silence felt like a physical weight, a judgment pressing against his temples. He had won, he had removed the threat, he had restored the order of his empire, and yet his chest felt like it had been hollowed out with a rusted blade. His mother's agitated cries still echoed in the vents, and Seo-jun's empty, accusing stare remained burned into his retinas. He reached for a glass of amber liquid, his hand steady but his mind a fractured map of doubt. He was a man who lived by the creed of absolute proof. A man who believed that if a thing could not be measured or seen on a high-definition feed, it did not exist. But the proof he had acted upon, the bruises, the elegant testimony of his fiancée, had left his home feeling like a graveyard. Suddenly, the silence was punctured by a sharp, electronic pulse. His personal smartphone, a device usually reserved for the movements of global markets, vibrated against the hard surface of the desk. The screen flickered to life, casting a murky pallor over his face. It was a message from Seo-jun. Seo-jun hesitated, his breath hitching in the stillness. He tapped the screen, and the darkness of the office was suddenly pierced by a low-resolution window into a truth he had been too blind to see. The video began in the upstairs hallway, the camera shaky, held by the trembling hands of a child. He watched, frozen, as his mother emerged from her room, a fragile shadow drifting toward a fall that looked like a death sentence. He saw her collapse. He heard the sickening thud of her body striking the floor. And then he saw the shark. Ye-jin Bridge stepped into the frame, her silhouette as sharp as a scalpel. She didn't move. She didn't help. She simply stood there watching his mother struggle with a detached, chilling curiosity. The air in the office seemed to vanish. Seo-jun's fingers tightened around the phone until the glass groaned. Then Lidia Vane burst into the frame. He watched the woman he had exiled, the woman he had called a monster, throw herself onto the floor, her face a map of raw, unvarnished agony as she gathered his mother into her arms. Lidia was weeping, her voice a broken prayer of comfort, her touch the only thing keeping the elderly woman from drifting away. The clip ended, the screen fading to black, leaving Seo-jun alone in the dark. The proof was finally undeniable. His fortress had not been breached from the outside. The monster had been sleeping in his own bed. Under the cold Chicago moon, the man of stone felt the first crack in his soul, and the rage that began to boil in his veins was a fire that would consume everything in its path. The digital glow of the smartphone screen was a cold fire, burning away the cataracts of Seo-jun's pride. He sat in the hollow silence of his office, replaying the footage until the pixels seemed to sear into his very soul. The two faces of truth were laid bare before him, a brutal, unblinking binary that shattered the glass walls of his world. On the screen, he saw Lidia Vane, the woman he had dismissed as a mere servant, a dusk in his halls, transformed into a warrior of compassion. Her face was a map of raw, unvarnished agony as she cradled his mother's fragile frame. He watched the way she wept, not out of fear for herself, but out of a desperate, sacrificial love for a woman who could offer her nothing in return. Every movement Lidia made was an act of grace, a frantic prayer of comfort that pulsed with the heat of a genuine human heart. Then the camera drifted, capturing the second face, the face of the woman he had intended to marry. Ye-jin Bridge stood at the periphery of the frame, a statuesque pillar of ice in her ivory designer suit. She didn't wince. She didn't move. She watched his mother struggle against the hardwood floor with a detached, clinical curiosity that was more terrifying than any physical blow. In her eyes, Seo-jun saw the void, a hollow, exploitative indifference that calculated the cost of a life without ever feeling its value. She was a gargoyle in silk, waiting for the weakness to consume itself, her silence a confession of a soul that had long since rotted behind a mask of high society perfection. Seo-jun felt a rough, primeval rage boiling in his chest, a heat that threatened to melt the steel and obsidian of his desk. He had built an empire on the ability to read people, yet he had been a fool blinded by the aesthetics of his own class. He had traded a diamond for a shard of broken glass. The monstrous Maid was the only person who had actually bled for his family, while the perfect fiancée had stood over the dying embers of his mother's dignity and felt nothing but the chill of her own ambition. The truth was no longer a debate. It was a revelation that carried the weight of a thunderbolt. As the Chicago wind screamed outside his fortress, Han Seo-jun stood up, his jaw set in a mask of lethal, unyielding stone. The trial was over, the judgment was reversed, and the man who had forgotten how to feel was about to remind the world that even a fortress can be a place of terrible, righteous justice. The dawn over Chicago was a rough, gray serration that offered no warmth, only a cold, revealing light that bled through the Han mansion's floor-to-ceiling windows. Han Seo-jun stood in the center of the grand foyer, his silhouette a dark, unyielding monument against the rising sun. He did not move. He waited, the silence of the house vibrating with the kinetic energy of a storm about to break. When Ye-jin Bridge descended the marble staircase, draped in a silk robe that cost more than a year of Lydia's wages, she carried the air of a victor returning to a conquered city. She offered a practiced porcelain smile, but it faltered and died when she met Seo-jun's eyes. They were not the eyes of a fiancé. They were the eyes of a hunter who had finally scented the rot. Without a word, Seo-jun raised his hand, the smartphone in his palm glowing with the incriminating fire of the midnight video. The footage played in the heavy silence. The fall, her cold observation, Lydia's frantic, weeping care. Ye-jin's face drained of color, the mask of high society perfection cracking in the harsh morning light. For a heartbeat she tried to weave a new lie, her voice a desperate, fluttering thing, but Seo-jun's silence was a physical blow that crushed the words in her throat. Then the mask shattered completely. The elegance vanished, replaced by a raw, sharp hysteria that had been festering beneath her couture skin. Her voice rose to a shriek, a cacophony of insecurity and long-simmering jealousy that echoed off the granite walls. She didn't deny the footage, she weaponized her resentment. She spat out her hatred for Lidia, her voice trembling with the poison of a woman who felt threatened by a maid's genuine heart. She was taking everything. Ye-jin screamed, her eyes wide and wild. Your mother looked at her with more love than she ever gave me. That servant. That nobody. She was the one you trusted. I had to break her. I had to make you see her as the monster I knew she was. Seo-jun watched her, his jaw set like a vice. He didn't see the woman he had intended to marry. He saw a hollow vessel of pride and malice. The insecurity she had hidden behind her pedigree was now a gaping wound, bleeding out on his marble floor. He realized then that she hadn't loved him or his family. She had only loved the power his name provided and loathed the one person whose quiet goodness highlighted her own internal void. The air in the foyer felt tainted by her presence. As her tirade collapsed into ragged, ugly sobs of defeated ego, Seo-jun's voice cut through the air, cold and final as a winter execution. The trial was over, the truth was naked, and the woman who had tried to murder a family's soul was finally, utterly exposed. The air in the grand foyer was thick with the ozone of a dying lie, a cold, electric tension that made the skin crawl. Ye-jin Bridge stood amidst the wreckage of her own vanity, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with the realization that the fortress she had sought to rule had become her cage. She looked at Seo-jun, searching for a glimmer of the man who had once been blinded by her pedigree, but she found only a monolith of righteous fury. His silence was a physical weight, a crushing gravity that stripped away her designer armor until she was nothing but a hollow vessel of malice. Seo-jun did not shout. He did not need to. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, primeval rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very granite of the floor. It was the sound of a king pronouncing a permanent exile. The command was a sharp blade, cutting through the last of her hysterical protests. She was to leave this house, this property, and this city, and if her shadow ever darkened his gates again, the consequences would be biblical. He did not look at her as a man looks at a woman he once loved. He looked at her as a surgeon looks at a malignant growth that has finally been excised. Ye-jin's composure dissolved into a raw, sharp desperation. She reached out, her manicured fingers clawing at the air as if she could grasp the disappearing threads of her power, but Seo-jun stepped back, his disgust a palpable shield. The high society queen was gone, replaced by a broken wolf who had lost its scent. Behind him, the silent, stony-faced security team moved into the light, their presence a promise of the force that awaited her if she lingered. With a final, strangled sob of defeated ego, Ye-jin turned. The clicking of her expensive heels against the marble sounded like the rapid, desperate heartbeat of a retreating animal. She fled through the massive oak doors, out into the biting Chicago wind that showed no mercy to those without a soul. As the doors groaned shut, the sound echoed through the mansion like a gunshot, signaling the end of an era of deception. Seo-jun stood alone in the center of the foyer, the gray morning light bleeding through the windows. The poison had been removed, but the silence that remained was heavy with the cost of his blindness. He looked at the empty hall where Lidia had once stood, and for the first time in his life, the titan of industry felt the crushing weight of a debt that could not be paid with gold. The Chicago morning was a rough, gray beast, and Seo-jun was riding into its belly. He had traded the armored luxury of his chauffeur-driven limousine for the raw, mechanical roar of his blackest sedan, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity that bordered on the religious. The fortress of glass was behind him, a hollow monument to a man who had been blind to the gold in his own dirt. Now he was a king without a crown, a father without a North Star, navigating the fractured arteries of the city in search of the woman he had crucified with his silence. He drove through the transition of Chicago, from the sterile vertical canyons of the Loop to the sprawling, bruised neighborhoods where the elevated trains screamed like dying giants. The GPS coordinates for Lidia Vane's address felt like a mockery, a digital breadcrumb trail leading him toward a reality he had never deigned to visit. He saw the city now not as a balance sheet, but as a map of human struggle, a landscape where a woman like Lidia had carved out a life of quiet dignity while he had sat in his high tower, counting his copper. The streets grew narrower, the brickwork worn and weary under the weight of 1,000 winters. He felt a visceral twisting guilt in his gut, a primeval heat that no Chicago wind could cool. He had sent her here, to the shadows, to the struggle, because he had believed an elegant lie over a humble truth. Every stoplight was a sharp heartbeat. Every corner turned was a prayer for time he didn't deserve. He remembered the way she had lowered her head when he gave the order, the way she hadn't fought him, and the memory felt like a rusted blade turning in his chest. Finally, he pulled to the curb in a modest neighborhood where the air smelled of salt, exhaust, and the stubborn hope of the working class. He stepped out of the car, his expensive wool coat a foreign object in this weathered world. He didn't look like a titan of industry. He looked like a man who had walked through a fire of his own making. He scanned the rows of narrow houses, his breath hitching as he searched for the one that held the heart of his family. The mission was no longer about profit or power. It was a desperate, unpolished pilgrimage for a redemption that gold could never buy. He began to walk, his jaw set in a mask of grim, sacrificial purpose. He had to find her. He had to look into the eyes of the woman he had wronged and see if there was enough light left in the world to forgive a man who had forgotten how to see. The modest porch of the weathered Chicago row house felt like a sacred altar as Seo-jun stepped onto its boards. The air here was thin, stripped of the manufactured luxury of his estate, smelling only of damp brick and the cold, honest reality of the streets. When the door finally groaned open, Lidia Vane stood there, her silhouette framed by the dim light of a hallway that had never known the glow of a crystal chandelier. She didn't quail, she didn't retreat. She simply looked at him with eyes that had already processed the grief he had forced upon her. For the first time in his life, the titan of industry found himself without a script. The power that moved markets and commanded armies had vanished, leaving behind only the raw, rugged pulse of a man who had stared into the void of his own failure. Seo-jun did not speak from the height of his status. He lowered his head, his shoulders dropping the weight of 1,000 pretenses, and when he finally looked at her, his dark eyes were bright with a terrifying, unvarnished humility. The words were not an order. They were a confession, a slow, gut-wrenching bleeding of the soul. He told her about the video. He told her about the wolf he had invited into his bed and the angel he had cast into the snow. His voice, usually a cold instrument of command, was a broken, primeval rasp that vibrated with the heat of a genuine human heart. "I was blind," he whispered, the sound carrying the weight of 1,000 years of regret. "I built a fortress to protect my family, but I was the one who let the monster in. I traded the truth for a lie, and I broke the only heart that truly bled for us." He reached out not as a boss reaching for a servant, but as a beggar reaching for grace. He didn't offer a check or a contract, he offered his shame. He asked for her forgiveness, acknowledging that no amount of gold could ever repay the debt of her tears or the scars of his silence. Lidia watched him, her own chest heaving with the weight of the moment. She saw the man of stone finally crack, the glass of his pride shattering at her feet. In the quiet of that Chicago street, under the gray, indifferent sky, the power dynamic was finally, utterly reversed. The king was on his knees, and as the silence stretched between them, Seo-jun realized that the greatest power in the world wasn't the ability to rule, but the courage to be seen in all his brokenness by the one person he had tried to destroy. The return to the Han estate was not marked by the fanfare of a conqueror, but by a quiet, holy restoration. As Seo-jun's sedan crested the drive of the Chicago fortress, the gray oppressive weight that had sat upon the mansion for days seemed to dissolve into the biting winter air. Lidia Vane sat in the passenger seat, her eyes fixed on the towering glass walls she had once believed would be her prison of shame. She didn't enter with the posture of a servant returning to a job. She moved with the steady, quiet strength of a woman who had walked through the fire and emerged with her soul intact. The massive oak doors groaned open, but this time the air that spilled out was not clinical or cold. It was charged with a frantic, desperate hope. Before Lidia could even clear the threshold, the silence was shattered by a sound that had been missing from the mansion's sterile heart for too long, the raw, unbridled cry of a child. Sumin did not run. She collided with Lidia, her small arms wrapping around the woman's waist with a grip that spoke of a drowning soul finding its anchor. The 7-year-old wept into Lydia's uniform, her body racking with sobs of pure, unadulterated relief. Lidia went to her knees on the marble floor, gathering the child into her embrace, her own tears falling like a benediction over the girl's dark hair. The transformation was biological, a visceral shifting of the house's very chemistry. In the upstairs suite, the grandmother, who had spent days drifting in a sea of agitated shadows, suddenly grew still at the sound of Lydia's voice echoing in the vents. When Lidia entered her room moments later, the elderly matriarch didn't wince or pull away. She reached out, her frail, translucent fingers grasping Lydia's hand with a strength that defied her years. The confusion in her eyes cleared, replaced by a deep, soulful recognition that no high-priced medication could ever provide. The bruises on her arms were fading, but the healing of her spirit was instantaneous. Seo-jun stood in the doorway, a dark monument watching the resurrection of his own family. He saw the color returning to his daughter's cheeks and the peace settling into his mother's tired frame. He saw Lidia moving through the rooms, her presence a quiet flame that finally reached the cold corners of his granite halls. The digital feeds and security grids felt like ancient, useless relics compared to the heat of the human connection unfolding before him. The fortress was no longer a tomb. As the Chicago sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a golden light across the foyer, the man of stone realized that the homecoming wasn't just for Lidia. It was for the heart of the man who had almost let it die. The Chicago spring arrived not as a whisper, but as a hard-won victory, the sun finally breaking the back of a brutal winter to bathe the Han estate in a light that felt like a shared absolution. In the grand garden, where the glass walls of the mansion met the resilient earth, the air was no longer sterile. It was alive with the scent of blooming jasmine and the raw, unscripted sound of a child's laughter. Soo-min ran through the grass, her movements free of the somber weight she had carried for so long, her joy a testament to the restoration of the world. Nearby, the grandmother sat in a pool of golden warmth, her eyes clear and peaceful as she watched the girl, her spirit finally anchored in the quiet safety of the home she had almost lost. Han Seo-jun stood at the edge of the terrace, his dark eyes no longer scanning for threats or calculating the cost of a lie. He looked at Lidia Vane, who stood beside him, her silhouette framed by the sprawling Chicago skyline. She was no longer wearing the uniform of her exile. She stood in her own light, a woman whose dignity had been tested by fire and found to be pure gold. The silence between them was no longer the heavy, suffocating weight of the fortress. It was a living, breathing thing, a bridge built on the ruins of his pride. Seo-jun turned to her, and for the first time, the titan of industry allowed himself to be seen without his armor. He didn't speak of contracts or status. He looked at her with a terrifying, soulful clarity that acknowledged the debt he could never repay. He saw the woman who had walked into the smoke and the lies for his blood, and in that gaze, the last of the boundaries dissolved. He reached out, his hand finally finding hers, not as a master to a servant, but as a man reaching for the anchor of his own humanity. Lidia met his gaze, her face a map of the pain they had survived and the hope they had earned. She didn't need words to forgive him. The truth had already done the work. In this sacred, sun-drenched moment, they were no longer defined by the roles the world had assigned them. They were simply a family, forged in the heat of a betrayal and tempered by a love that had grown from the ashes of being understood. As the wind stirred the trees, Han Seo-jun realized that his fortress was finally complete, not because of the height of its walls, but because of the depth of the truth that now lived within them. They stood together, a dark monument and a quiet flame, finally, utterly at peace.